I'm Rod Suskin, and I'm here to talk to you about astrology and the coronavirus crisis. Astrology and the coronavirus crisis sound like two things that don't belong together, but I'm the astrologer Rod Suskin, and I'm here to tell you about how they do. You know, it is true that we have a lot of misunderstandings and misconceptions about astrology anyway. And so we do need to have a little bit of an understanding of what astrology is really doing to understand even how it can talk about something like the coronavirus crisis. Of course, astrologers famously, make predictions all the time. We're going to talk a little bit later on about what predictions astrologers might have made about this crisis. And since we talk about the future, well, we don't only want to talk about what predictions were made, we want to have a look at what astrology says about what we can expect the outcome of all of this to be. How's the virus trajectory and the crisis itself going to develop? And of course, where are we going to be at the end of all of that? Because, a lot of people, I'm sure you all have experienced it, kind of acting like it's either the end of the world or as if this is like the biggest, most important change that we're ever going to see. We hear a lot. I've heard the word unprecedented a lot. I'm sure you have. And words like that and ideas like that, we've never seen such a big change before, and what's going to be the outcome, the changed world and the world as we knew it. And I thought, well, since astrologers are comfortable with talking about the future and what that future world is, let's actually just get a perspective from astrology on that. But where I'm going to start is with what astrology is really all about with relation to things like this. People think we talk about the influence of the planets and all of those things that you read about your personality characteristics that supposedly are coming from the influence of the planets and all of those types of things. I think in modern times, of course, astrologers don't really think of it as an influence, but that there's a bigger process that we can understand through modern eyes as the process of cycles and understanding cycles. Ancient people, thousands of years ago, the Babylonians who developed astrology, they were interested in conquering the world. And what they had already noticed is that things repeat themselves. We would say the language, things happen in cycles. So they began to use their advanced development of a calendar, which they were busy on, to track those cycles. They noticed that the moving stars, the ones that they called the planets, eventually get back to where they were after a while. So they essentially worked out how to use the planets as a clock. The Babylonians were interested in conquering the world, and they knew that if they figure when something's going to happen, they wanted to know things like what the weather would be and whether this was a good time to have a war and go and conquer somebody. So they wrote down the positions of the stars and the planets and the clouds even every single day for 770 years. It's the longest longitudinal study done by any human beings, and our modern science refuses to recognize it. But be that as it may, what they effectively had done is they developed a way to understand cycles and how things indeed do repeat themselves. Later on, people would refine the cyclical system out of all of that. But essentially, if you want to know how to conquer the world, you need to know the cycles of weather, of war, of human aggression, and all the things that make you a successful emperor. Ask any Babylonian. So we know they succeeded. And in fact, the astrology exists to this very day. We've got much better tools and we've got more planets to work with. And it's those more planets that we need to talk about today. So the faraway distant planets that, like Pluto and Neptune and Uranus, those planets that we can't even see with our own eyes, they move so slowly that astrologers use them to measure what we call generational time. We all have our own lives and our own karma, or our own destiny, or however you want to think of it. But at the same time, we live in a society, we live in a country, we live in a world that is affected by stuff. And well, look at this coronavirus crisis. We all now know for sure to the extent of which we are affected by great big things that happen around us that have got nothing to do with our personal fate. So it's those cycles that we look at times like this. And these are the cycles of social change. Those great big invisible planets are like big hands of a clock that measure social change. And we have seen two of those major cycles, clock cycles, kind of tick during the course of this century so far. The one we saw happen in the period 2008-ish, I have to say 2008 to 2012, which makes you realize that, of course, they last longer than a year. And then there's the one that we find ourselves in right now. And of course, that's 2020. We'll speak later on about what other years that might involve, if any. But here's the important thing to know and to realize right from the beginning, that if I'm talking about a regular repetitive cycle, then it immediately throws out the idea that anything is unprecedented. Astrology says nothing is unprecedented. In fact, I reckon the average historian might tell you exactly the same thing. As much as everything feels so brand new and feels so challenging and all of these things, I mean, it is challenging. It has happened before. It's happened before so recently that it's in most of our living memory, and yet we don't really remember it that well. And unfortunately, that's part of the human condition. It's why we have sayings like, those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. It's because we do forget history that we say things like that. And when we look at why do human beings as a whole do damaging and destructive things, which say we learn quickly. Like a famous example is we quickly learned to domesticate wheat, or did it learn to domesticate us? Because we went from healthy hunter-gatherers to carrying stones to make wheat fields to broken land-bound human beings without much nutrition from that wheat. And when you inquire of a human being, why do you do that? Our answer would be, because our ancestors did it, or we always have done this. And historians show us, well, that always is usually maybe 2 generations at the most. We don't easily remember. This particular cycle, the great big planets Saturn and Pluto measure this particular cycle that we're in now, and that astrologers, quite frankly, have been worried about for a very long time. The popular press here and there, especially in the States, has said recently and during the course of this year, have said things like, oh, well, the coronavirus crisis proves that astrology is nonsense, or the New York Times called it the death of astrology. Because all of them, even including our own Gareth Cliff, people who are big in the media, they don't look much beyond themselves as the media. So you have all of these people who I've just mentioned saying astrologers never predicted this. It proves astrology is nonsense and astrology is dead because astrologers never predicted this. Now, of course, astrologers did predict this. But the thing is, astrologers don't get to speak to the ear of anyone in power. Astrologers don't get very much press. I mean, the Weekend Argus has always been enlightened that way, and a lot of publications might be, but it's relatively rare for astrologers to be able to put out information as much as what our society accepts as information from anyone else. And who's listening? So even if an astrologer does manage to say something, who's really listening? No one who could make any difference, certainly so. But as I say, astrologers do talk about it. I myself, like most astrologers that I know of, actually predicted 2020 as a world war, which is a hectic enough idea, but most predicted it as world war. I know of 2 that actually said it was a pandemic that was coming, but most of us said it's a war. My words in January of 2019 were world war. In January of 2020, I said that every single government in the world is going into crisis over the next month. I think I was 1 month out on that one. And I couldn't have imagined what that really, really meant. When people criticize astrology that way, they also don't realize that it's not a psychic art. I'm not getting information from anywhere. I'm studying what are effectively scientific cycles, things that have been measured and studied over and over again and interpreted in a certain way. But by looking at those cycles, I can make deductions based on what I know about things like Saturn and Pluto. I'm going to tell you more about them in a second, but things like Saturn and Pluto. And that allows us to see what type of thing do we expect. But if I say pandemic or if I say war, it's almost a guess which one it's going to be, because it's anything that's huge and destructive, causing a lot of death on a large scale that involves every country in the world. Both of them do. So even though, of course, we might not have actually said, every astrologer might have actually said it's a world war or it's a pandemic or specific, they're trying to describe these kind of circumstances that I've been talking about, these really difficult, challenging circumstances. So we need to unpack a little bit about what are those challenging circumstances? What's so challenging about them? What is this? Saturn and Pluto in astrology are both used to describe big fatalistic things over which we have no control. And unfortunately for us, we're still affected by those things that we have very little control over. And so, perhaps for want of a better word, we'll call that fate. We've got a certain amount, quite a lot of free will in our own lives, but certainly things affect us over which we have no power. And in that way, we kind of learn about the limitations of our world, how far we have power, what we can do about what we have. So Saturn and Pluto are really all about how are we limited, where are we limited, and unfortunately, especially by things that are difficult and challenging. So Saturn in particular is the classic thing that says this is fate, this is karma, there's a limit that has been reached. And Pluto is described as a destructive force that tears everything down completely in order to build it up again. And Saturn and Pluto have come together in 2020 as they do around about every 37 or 38 years. So I was talking at the beginning about these repetitive cycles, and 37 or 38 years ago was 1982, 1983. And that, in fact, was when the HIV/AIDS virus was identified and was the beginning of the HIV/AIDS pandemic. People don't think about it as a pandemic because it wasn't as contagious or spread the way that this one is, but it was much more deadly and would kill literally millions of people. When we remember that, we realize, oh my word, this is a pandemic. And of course, it was devastating. What was going on in the world at the time was governments weren't listening. People were pretending it wasn't happening because it started in the LGBTQ community. So people didn't really pay attention. And that led to a lot of activism, and a lot of social conflict, and eventually a lot of social change. But that was a gradual process over a long period of time. And so social change is not something that happens overnight. It is something that happens as a result of a big event like this coronavirus crisis. So it means gradually in the months that follow and the years that follow, we will begin to see the effects of it. But while we're in it, we don't really understand its full impact. Think about 1983. When the HIV/AIDS virus is discovered, it's shocking. We don't know what's going to happen, but what eventually arises slowly over decades out of that is a lot of social and political change around LGBTQ issues and around the stigma associated with AIDS and the stigma associated with being gay or the difficulties people suffered and the discrimination they suffered because of that. So there was a lot of social change that arose out of it, but it literally took decades for that to happen. So listen, I am seeing the message that some of you are struggling with the internet. I don't have any power over that. Broadcasting out of here, all the buttons look like they're doing fine. So hopefully you'll be able to sort that out. But as I was saying, the changes that we see are very, very slow changes that emerge out of this. Also, when you realize 37, 38 years, it isn't really that long. As I was saying at the beginning, it is right in our memory. Most of us can remember that time, and yet we quickly forget the impact it would make on the world. I mean, it did make a lot of impact on the world. One thing that you can think about is the extent to which sexual behaviors changed. And the whole idea, say, what to us is so normal, the idea that you wear a condom for anything other than birth control, is completely normal in our era. But 39 years ago was completely unheard of. And so there's an example of, yes, there are permanent changes. It changes our relationship with sex, with intimacy, with the other person, all of those things that particular pandemic did. So there are these lasting social changes, but you're really getting that they aren't great, big, unprecedented kinds of turnarounds. The interesting thing is that these great big cycles also have halfway points that are very sensitive. Of course, the halfway point between 82, 83 and 2020 is 2001. And 2001, 18 years into that cycle, is also a dramatically powerful cycle that would lead to massive social change out of one great big series of events that happened in a small space of time. So what we need to understand, what we're looking at, is that the way that natural social changes happen is there's a contraction that makes a lot happen in a short amounts of time. That's over the course of about a year or two, and then that will extend over the next, well, strictly speaking, 39 or 38 years, but let's even say clearly over half of that, 18, before it changes to something else. You might remember I said right at the beginning, we've seen two such things in our lifetime. The 2008 cycle, which is another one of the very slow cycles, that one also about every 40 years, that had previously come in 1968, when we also saw a massive amount of social change, concentrated, that would lead to eventually complete change of the world that grew out of the period 68 to about 71, 72, cultural change, America finishing with the Vietnam War by force, and the rise of the youth movement that became empowered to make radical social changes in the world. And so, how could we deal with this constructively is by looking at how it has worked before. That what we really do need now, wherever, not just about the virus itself, but it's always a reminder that social change comes from the level of the people, social. But in order for it to do that, you need big dramatic events. You need a big crisis, be it a war like 1968, or be it a terrorist event like 2001, be it an epidemic or pandemic crisis like it is right now, that causes us to re-examine ourselves and shift around our social relations. The truth still remains that when we are fully able to understand this, we'll be looking back on it by at least a 10-year distance down the line. So am I saying that everything will return to normal? Well, again, if we use our 1982-83 example as an example, you can see that it doesn't quite return to where it was. It is stepping forward, but it's not a leap forward off a cliff, which it looks like at the time. It turns out that it's just a step around a corner. And so we need to make a change in order to go around a corner. We're not heading in the same direction, but that change doesn't kill us. It's a part of nature's cycle. So I said that these things take about a year. And when we look at this particular bunch of planets, it's mostly 2020 that we have most concern about. Certainly, astrologers can see the early traces going back to November of last year, which is supposedly or purportedly or perhaps when the first case happens in Wuhan. And at the same time, we can see a certain amount, if you like, of dribbling into 2021. But for the most part, and somewhat conveniently as our calendar goes, it's confined into this period lasting till about October, November. From astrology's point of view, the peak of the crisis is August, September, and the crisis begins to break down around about October, November. By breakdown, I mean the planets are beginning to move out of their so-called alignment or that position, and gradually, things start going back to the normal ticking of everyday cycles. That can take all the way until February for us to fully see like the air has cleared. There's some other work that we can do with astrology that shows that 2021 and 2022, the issue is still around. It doesn't look, from astrology's point of view, as if after 2020 you could get a massive second or third wave, although it's certainly possible within 2020, depending on how fast things go. Remember, August, September is the really crunch point. That's the scariest time, astrologically speaking. So we haven't reached the scariest time yet. But and so maybe that could be, say, a so-called second wave in some countries, or peak in this one, or whatever. By 2021, it's not at that scale anymore, but it still keeps on showing itself. So I think what, if it aligns with anything that, say, the medical angle would be, is that certainly as a coronavirus and a form of a SARS virus that comes back, it may very well do so in 21 and 22 before it fades away from the scene, but it won't be doing it on an epidemic scale anymore. That scale of things is confined really to this period at the latest, lasting till October, November. The social changes that we're learning about are hopefully, and again, from the grassroots is how this happens, the ones that we can understand are the ones that need to happen are not about social distancing, they're about understanding poverty and need in our fellow human beings. They're about what we're learning needs to be done for each other. It's about learning that we're all responsible for people because we're all those people. So, and that's one thing that this crisis has really brought into the highlight. The panics of the specifics are real. The damage it did to business, it's terrible. All of that's true, and that is a real crisis. But at the same time, it's forcing us to restructure our economies and restructure our societies, unfortunately, perhaps not at a grand level. We'd love to believe that the world is going to be completely different after this, and it won't. It's going to be another evolutionary step different, not a big dramatic step. But this is the moment, this is the 0 point where, because we're in the cycle right now, on the one hand, we've got to deal with the stuff that it makes happen, but on the other hand, this is where to plant those seeds for how we want to help shape that social change. Think about people in 1968 who, they might have been rioting, they were getting clubbed by police like we see on our TV now every day. That was happening in the States and in Paris and so on. So those kind of things, they might have just looked like people rushing around in the streets, but they literally were laying the seeds for social change. The little movements, the grassroots movements, that keep on pushing, as small as they looked, we can look back and see, my word, those people really did change the world. And indeed, you can look back to 1983 and look at those early AIDS activists who could never have imagined a time where, by their efforts, there had been eventually political attention paid, medical attention paid, to the point where medicine eventually would put their resources. In the beginning, no one was willing even to look for a cure or a treatment because they didn't want to put their money there. So how do we spend our money? That's economics. And so it's the shifting of economics. It's not magic. It doesn't knock the people who are in power out of power. It just lays the scene for a different future. And by a different future, as I said, I mean when 10 years down the line, you're looking back. And that's what we need to understand. You might want to change the world tomorrow, but that wouldn't be a meaningful, even a realistic thing. It's really realizing that the opportunity we have here is to envision a future world that we still have to build. The virus isn't doing that for us. And much of our lives in 2021 are going to go back to how they were. A lot won't have changed. The damage will be visible, but mostly, we are a highly adaptable species. We've been through so many of these cycles before. And as I say, we actually reach the point where we forget. Believe it or not, in 18 years' time, people are going to have to deliberately scratch their memory to know that this happened. So that's why I say maybe the scale of change isn't as obvious as if I turned the world upside down. But if you realize it's a gradual process that in the end turns the world upside down, this is when you want to get in on the ground floor. This is when you need to be asking yourself, what can I do, even in small things, that help develop a better economy? And the thing that we can definitely do is that we've learned about responsibility. We saw a situation where through circumstances, unpreparedness, every government in the world, but certainly our own, was really unprepared to deal with what would happen to the poor and so on, just whatever lip service they might give to that. But the people themselves learned to deal with that. People learned about who's starving, who are their neighbors in the suburb or the township next door, and people started getting together to do something about that. And we don't need to wait for a virus to do that. We've learned that we need each other, and it's these circumstances that teach us we need each other. And from astrology's point of view, it gets us right back to what those ancient people were doing, that understanding that this is really about all of us and it affects all of us. And those great big cycles, they talk about our shared destinies, because of course we live at the same time in history, we have a shared destiny. But what they also are illustrating to us is if you understand what it is, then we actually have the power to affect that destiny. It's not the virus that makes change. It's not Saturn and Pluto that makes change. It's you and me that make change. This virus is a lot of very, very sad and difficult things, but it's also an inspiration and an opportunity. So I hope that in some way, the astrological point of view of these great important cycles helps us understand that. Thank you, everyone, for your attention, for your great comments, and hopefully I'll see you again some other time. For those of you who struggled with the reception, then you will, of course, find a recording of this on the Weekend August page. So thanks, everyone. Thanks, Weekend August. Hope to see you here again. See if there's any last questions. Okay, I think that is our story. Thank you all.